Welcome, I'm John Glanville, and this is video 51 in my Calmness in Mind series, where we explore common sense solutions for your calmer life. Now, this is going to be one of my last long format videos for a short while, as I reorientate myself into a phase of doing more learning, doing more hands-on experiential research, and producing shorter but more topic-specific videos and animations. And I've called this video, "What advice would I give my younger self?" Yeah? Common sense perspectives which might have helped him to better understand his complex anxiety issues and how the world seems to work. Because between the ages of 12 and 36, I really struggled with my emotions, and I fought with my brain all day and most nights. But now at the age of 59, I really love and respect myself, and I'm continually amazed at what my brain and body can do. What changed? Well, I changed. My inner reality changed. My self-awareness changed. My inner subjective reality of the events in the other outer objective reality were transformed and reprogrammed so that this inner reality became a far more pleasant place. Not only did I modify the horrible stories I told myself about myself and the outer world to become more kind, respectful, optimistic, inspiring and fun, but I also learned to interpret my brain's thoughts much less rigidly. I've become to accept that my brain is essentially a proposal generator for thoughts, dreams and imaginations, and it automatically and unconsciously keeps me alive and well if only I'm smart enough to get out of its way, to talk to it nicely, and to talk to it in the manner that it was designed in how to operate. And during my childhood, this device not only ran the programs that it was programmed with, but it also had the ability to learn and to create and to adapt based on the information it received from my surroundings and from the conscious stories that I was telling it each day. But back then, I hadn't learned just how brilliant yet fallible and how easily manipulated that computerized storage device for knowledge and memories in my head actually was. And it had been so deeply conditioned to accept the information that it received from authority sources, and therefore never thought to challenge or to test the accuracy or the truth of that knowledge. But after a pretty severe mental breakdown in my 30s, the engineer in me decided to see if he could figure out if his brain could be reconfigured to work for me rather than dominating, exhausting and scaring me. So as the observer of my brain's thoughts, I worked on changing my perspective to recognize that often those thoughts were simply metaphors, emotional desires, out-of-date safety stories, or even fantasies. So they didn't necessarily need to be understood or acted upon, and they could be ignored if I so wished. And I was really surprised to discover that I could consciously implant new placebo stories into my brain, tricking the unconscious part of my brain to function more favorably in line with finding calmness, regardless of the truth or whether those scientific stories that have been programmed were validated or not. I could implant self-loving, positive and optimistic statements into my brain, and if I repeated it often enough, they would start to come back to me. I adjusted my interpretation of physics, chemistry, biology and psychology to expand upon what science taught me in school to include the input of energy and intentions and the powerful effects of all those systems working together within the incredible electromagnetic field of energy and knowledge that we might call nature, the universe or divinity. And within my inner conscious awareness, I changed my values, my beliefs, my interpretations, my desires and my intentions to be more relevant to who I wish to be now rather than how I was programmed as a child. I then upgraded the degree of responsibility I took for the consequences of my life. I stopped blaming others, and I did whatever I could to enable the intentions and dreams I had for my life. And of course, over those years, the outer objective reality I lived in changed quite dramatically. And because I choose not to be an activist or a politician who'd go and fight these changes, I chose to find sensible ways to not allow them to demoralize anger or stop me from having a beautiful inner reality dream for myself as best that I could. I think that being said, though, I have chosen to see myself as a subtle influencer through how I live my life and creatively within my work. Now, for many years, I've been deeply influenced by the work of Dr. David R Hawkins, especially his concept of developing the skill to rapidly let go of thoughts, feelings, or mentations about events that were out of my control, or where I was consciously not prepared to take control. Jen and I have a game we play in which if something negative, sad, or disruptive happens that causes us anguish, the first person who can free themselves from that torment or that emotional trigger wins. So if we have an argument, or something goes wrong, or we're let down, or we have an accident, or whatever, we have managed to shrink that frustration or that disappointment time down into minutes rather than hours or even days. Now, I see this as a wonderful gift, not only to minimize the negative stress on our bodies, but also to be very respectful and playful within our relationship. Recently, we missed a flight, and we managed to let our negative stories and their corresponding emotional reactions to be surrendered within 30 minutes. After an hour, we were laughing about it. And then we went on to have a fun and unexpected adventure in the extra 24 hours a modified trip afforded us as we waited for the next day's flight. Can you see that all through this course I've been asking you to observe and to contemplate how optimistic, trusting and calm people might think and act, so that you might replicate those patterns if you like them and train them into your incredible brain. Yes, we had missed the plane. However, we took corrective action and we moved on. And just because the outer reality no longer matched our inner story, the obvious next step was to change our inner story to become a more pleasing one. If health and calmness were truly my intentions, no amount of complaining, thinking, worrying, blaming or regret would serve any purpose except to exhaust me and facilitate my poor little ego's feeding from negative emotions like receiving sympathy, beating myself up or complaining, none of which would help me in any way. I simply acknowledge what has happened, I sort it out, and I attempt to be kind to myself to the best of my conscious abilities. It's actually just a process, and quite simple once I understood it, though my ego did kick and scream as I learned how to starve it from its parasitic food sources of drama, worry, doubt, guilt and fear. Now, I'm not saying you should do these things or that I'm even right, just that these are some of the concepts and ideas that really, really helped me. So what I'm pointing to is, can you create a new subjective reality dream that's as pleasurable as possible within the current limits of your intellect and your logic-based ego? And can you free your inner self by doing this loving work on yourself while still under the intense and constant pressure from the media, corporations, government, society, and our education systems, which try to program you with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, so you remain a trapped and compliant consumer? So let's start by asking, what advice would I give my younger self? And importantly, how might I have needed to give young John that advice so that he would be open enough to listen? Because if I'm really honest, back then I was annoying, obnoxious, angry, and I was an opinionated know-it-all who actually naively didn't really know much about how the world operated, who rigidly stuck to what he believed was true from what he was taught was true by the environment that he grew up in. And back then I was so conditioned to believe what I was told and to always look for proof or to defer to authority or to trust authority before accepting any new information, that I would often fight to defend what I'd been taught, even if I'd never gone out and tested it on myself in the world to see if it was even true. So I think if I did travel back to the 1970s and I only had 10 minutes to give him all my real-world experiential knowledge, I think the first 9 minutes would probably have been spent arguing with him to prove I was really there and wasn't a dream or a hallucination or somebody playing a trick on him. But anyway, let's assume that by some miracle, back then he had an open mind and he was prepared to listen and he was prepared to test out new concepts before he shot them down. I think the first thing I would tell him was that he had completely misunderstood two very important concepts. The concepts of creativity and talent. And that these are individual and unique skills, sometimes innate, perhaps God-given, or perhaps they were chosen and developed through desire, practice and determination, or maybe they were forcibly developed in reaction to the needs of the environment that he was raised within. But I tell him that just because he believed he lacked talent because he couldn't sing, dance, play musical instruments, speak foreign languages, write poetry, or have any talents that were easily demonstrated to others, it didn't mean that he wasn't talented. But he had used that story of not being talented to shape his self-perception, which lowered his confidence and erroneously made him think that he had to do things perfectly to compensate. And I tell him that many of his creative talents and skills were invisible or intangible. They were organizational, interpersonal, they were imaginative, they were problem solving, they were facilitating, they were being of value in a crisis, they were for generating concepts and ideas, they were communication skills or inspiring or leading skills. And I tell him that most people wouldn't have even noticed when he used his talents, though they often benefited from them. Therefore, it would be far more sensible to learn how to self-validate rather than to let his ego continuously fight to receive external validation from other people. And I'd say that just because it's hard to stand up in a talent contest and demonstrate those creative talents, it doesn't mean that they're not there or that he is any less talented than those people who can. And I would suggest to him that he learn how to be more playful, more light-hearted and more cheeky, because that would teach him how to be less self-conscious. And this vulnerability would loosen his ego's silly need to control what other people think of him. And I'd then ask him to explore Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self, whereby we are seemingly blind to negative and destructive traits within ourselves, like anger and control, though those same traits may annoy us when we see them displayed in other people. And I'd remind him that not only does the shadow self hide negative behaviors, but it may often conceal greatness too. Just as much as he wished others would see the greatness that he saw in them and wished that they would act upon, he too, with humility, should do the same. And I would explain that due to his complex personality type, that he is somewhat different from others. Therefore, there is no point in comparing himself with them or expecting them to understand him. Instead, he should focus on comparing himself to see how far he can grow and how far he's come, and he should embrace and enjoy his individuality. And next I would tell him, can you learn how to think in terms of energy and intuition? And can you begin to use intuition as your primary sense and intellectual logic and reason secondarily, which is quite the opposite of what he was taught to do in school. I would say if something feels wrong, it likely is. And if it feels right, that might be just enough information to take action. And I would advise him that if he needs to overanalyze everything before making a decision, then he's probably making the wrong decision. I would tell him to not dismiss his heartfelt or gut feelings or inexplicable intuition. These are his connections to nature and divinity, and he should learn to listen to them, and he should learn how to further develop those skills. I would remind him that he only has a limited amount of biological or emotional energy available each day, and that he should use that energy wisely on things that align with his intentions for his life and the people he wishes to have in his life. But probably the most important thing I tell him is that calmness is key to everything. It would allow him to sleep better, to recharge his body, to raise his immunity, to access his creativity, and to enhance his thinking. Plus, this calmness would produce a field of energy that positively affects what or who is in that localized field. I would remind him about the importance of sleep and the quality of that sleep. And even though he can function without much sleep, he shouldn't, due to the negative effects this has on metabolic health and brain clarity. And I would remind him that he's a giant chemistry set. And yes, he could justify being angry or sad due to some external event. However, his body would react accordingly by releasing stress chemicals that would biologically exhaust and damage his cells and leave him feeling low. Therefore, the speed at which he can let things go through acceptance, change, or moving away should be biologically factored into his thoughts and his behaviors. I would explain to him the importance of understanding epigenetics, whereby the total environment his cells grow within affects the expression and regulation of his genes and therefore his biological health. And this means that environmental factors such as diet, stress, work, relationships, families, and rest, and a positive, conscious mindset are massively important. A calm and happy person in a busy environment is often metabolically healthier than a lonely, angry, or stressed person in a calm environment. And I think that's maybe one reason that some people on home-based sick leave with anxiety or depression don't get better. Yes, they're in a calm environment, but they still worry like crazy, thus dysregulating their inner chemistry and further exhausting themselves. I would tell him that usually it's boring people who get bored easily, and those without a compelling dream for their lives who get stuck or depressed. So he should have many varied interests and always be taking actions towards his dreams and his intentions. I would explain to him that he had been misled about the right food for his particular body type, and that if he wished to intensify his natural immunity, his metabolic health and his energy levels, he should focus on eating meats and eggs and saturated fats like butter, so his cells would receive the optimal nutrients that they were designed for. And I would remind him that his cells tend to use carbohydrates as their primary energy source, even though burning fat is better for them. Therefore, to maintain a lean body and have healthy cells, I would advise him to not consider carbohydrates as a food group, but rather as an emergency fuel source or an occasional treat. I would next explain to young John that sadly much of the world's population is manipulated and controlled by guilt and shame. And I would say that these feelings are the lowest, ugliest, angriest, and the most exhausting and wretched of all emotions, as demonstrated at the base of the Dr. Hawkins map of consciousness. And that he should take time to examine how these emotions function, who uses them, how to rise above them, how to not use those mindsets on others or himself, and how to defend himself against those people whose negative energy levels are below 200, thus detrimental to his well-being, and who might try to guilt, belittle, or shame him. I would tell him that guilt is feeling bad about what you've done, whereas shame is feeling bad about who you are. And both of these are ugly attitudes that can and should be overcome through self-respect and more honesty. Because if he can extract himself from the content of his guilty or shameful stories up into the context of the situation in which they occurred, and then up again to consider that situation from other points of view, factoring in other people's circumstances and other people's points of view, it quickly becomes quite clear that these painful stories originate from a very egoistic and self-centered victim perspective. It's like, it's all about me, 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 me. I can't believe that I did that thing, or it must have been my fault, or I should have helped them, I should have known better, or they're expecting me to be as good as them, or what will they think if I do that thing? I would explain to him that this narcissistic, self-indulgent behavior is not only unattractive, but painful too, and it should be stopped as soon as possible. I tried to point out that the I he is referring to in guilty thoughts such as, I let them down, that I is not a real person. It's merely an expectation, a responsibility, a concept, a virtual reality story embellished with hindsight and then thrust upon himself, when in fact he was just simply doing what he did, and on a different day he might have done something different. I would tell him that there is nothing that he ought to have done, or he should have known, or was expected to do, as these rules or expectations are only valid for those who wish to play by tribal, cultural, or religious agreements. And I'd remind him that because happiness was his goal, rather than being nice or right, he would have to learn to let go of guilt and respectfully apply guilt fibs when necessary. I would explain to him that in its simplest form, a guilt agreement is only possible between two consenting players. The first who chooses to apply the guilt, and the second who chooses to receive that guilt or that judgment. Because if the first person says, well, I haven't seen you for so long, your work must be more important than I am. And if the other person says, yes, it is, and then just smiles, the guilt agreement can't begin, because the second person had enough honesty and self-esteem to say what it meant calmly and without taking anything personally. So I would explain to young John that guilt comes from having low self-esteem, and we might define self-esteem as the degree with which you won't let others be horrible to you, and the skill of learning how to be honest and nice to yourself. I'd add that if his own brain were trying to guilt him, surely that is just self-abuse, as there's nobody else trying to do it to him, so that wouldn't be at all sensible. More likely, the judgment aspect of his brain is prodding the victim aspect of his brain and allowing his hurt ego to feed parasitically from all that emotional drama. I would explain to him that where possible, it's best to avoid those who try to guilt him, and when he can't remove himself from them, that he should reply with respectful guilt fibs to not accept that guilt. Let me give you an example. If a person says, I can't believe you would have done such a thing, I would suggest that his range of responses may range from, it's none of your business, right through to, oh, that was such a long time ago, I've changed so much, I don't do that anymore. Or perhaps he could just listen to what they said so they feel heard, and then they'll stop badgering him. However, inwardly, he'd completely dismiss the comment as it just wasn't his problem. NMP. Let me give you an example. If someone tried to guilt him by saying, I thought you were a much kinder person, he might simply say, thank you for bringing that to my attention. They feel hurt, so they be quiet. There's no defensive argument. And by swallowing his pride, he hasn't made the issue personally. Of course, some frustration or anger or some other emotion may still be triggered, but they can just be released in the background, and they no longer initiate defensive or attacking responses, as the emotion has been separated from the stories. And I would explain to him that people can only guilt you if you let them. And there is never any excuse to guilt yourself. I tell him to acknowledge past mistakes and to move on. Okay? And I would go on to remind him that his brain has two hemispheres. The left being more animal and egoistic with strong desires to get things and to receive attention. And he shouldn't let those animal instincts dominate him. Yeah? Sure, they're there, and he can accept that they're part of him, but they can be subdued to the best of his abilities. Yeah? And his right brain, more spiritual hemisphere, only makes errors out of ignorance, not self-indulgence. Therefore, it's important to separate his animal instincts from his spiritual self. And this is why the horse and rider metaphor works so well. His soul as the rider can influence his body, the horse, though he will never be able to fully control it. So when the animal side plays up, he can simply smile and accept it and still do whatever else he chooses to do. Next up, I would advise him, where possible, to always tell the truth to himself and others, okay? And where that's not possible, to either remain silent or to fib with integrity. I tell him to never lie to somebody who trusts him and never trust anybody who lies to him. And I suggest that saying no to another person, if that's how he feels, is saying yes to himself. Okay? He should stop trying to be a people pleaser, and he should be more honest about what he wants, and he should never be afraid to ask directly anybody for what he needs. He should recognize that his words have power and that he should use his words wisely. The output from his mouth and his observed behaviors will be the input into another person's brain, thus forming their virtual reality story that their brain will record, and this story will later be used to unconsciously decide how to remember and how to treat him. So I would say, don't assume that people know you. If the person is important to you, okay, you might consider what virtual reality story you might want to train into that other person's brain, or do you need to update an old virtual reality story that that person has of you in their brain? And I would suggest that he consider the concept that the word truth can mean anything to anybody. Therefore, to consider what is true for him and to decide whether he can live his life in truth according to his own definition of the word truth. I would suggest that integrity, honesty, creativity, love and trust might be some truths that it's worth him fighting for. Okay, so if we switch topics to anxiety, OCD and depression, I would tell him that if he could live in line with all the information I've just given him, most of his anxiety would simply go away. Because the truth is, most of his anxiety and depression stem from living life in an anxious and depressive manner, from worrying, controlling, fearing, pessimism, people-pleasing, trying to be perfect, and overworking and exhausting himself. And of course, you know, what I'm about to say is covered in my course, but the headlines that I would say to him are, don't try to remain the same person and hope your anxiety will go away. I would say to him, he has to become a new person in which anxiety would struggle to be able to bother him. Yeah. And I'd also say that if there wasn't a little anxiety in his life from time to time, it means that he needs to dream bigger and do more things. I'd say to him that his thoughts and feelings don't have to mean anything, and they don't have to stop him from taking action in any moment. He was not born with anxiety. He developed it after trauma or exhaustion, or it was trained into him in the environment that he developed within. I would remind him that unrequested intrusive thoughts were normally just his unconscious brain trying to grab his attention. And it does that by reversing who he really is by 180 degrees and trying to shock him. Therefore, thoughts of harming, sexual abuse, becoming contaminated, suicide, needing security, were just his unconscious brain trying to grab his conscious awareness to tell him that he's exhausted and he should be living his life differently. And I would tell him that he'll find it liberating once he realizes that these unrequested thoughts are the opposite of who he truly is, so subsequently they can be ignored. I would stress to him the absolute importance of using ERP to deregulate his anxious and hypersensitive nervous system, and then to retrain his brain's negative internal thoughts into positive I story ERP ones. And I would share with him one of the biggest anxiety recovery secrets, which is to use ERP on what he needs to change in his life, not on what makes him anxious. Because if he changes what makes him anxious, the anxiety will just move to something else. But if he works on his life, you'll have to move through all those anxieties to get on with your life. And I would challenge him to realize that if he was not using smart ERP strategies every day, then he would be unconsciously self-sabotaging his own recovery. And finally, I would explain to him that much of his inner turmoil came from the many inner aspects of himself being in conflict through ignorance. His frustrated warrior needed to be more dominant. His bored nomad required to be more selfish, creative and playful. And his anxious settler needed more love and connection, and it needed to become the calm modality that held everything together. Those three inner aspects of himself needed to work as a team with each other, respecting each other's needs, each other's talents, and respecting each other's varied belief systems, but he only uses one modality at a time. Next up, I tell him that it's not okay to not know what he wants from life and who he wishes to become. Life is too short, and procrastination is the thief of time. And if he doesn't know what he wants, he should actively try many new things until he stumbles upon what he does want through experience rather than through thought. I would tell him to drop the story that there is a right or wrong way to do anything. These are just invisible boundaries society uses to try to control us. I'd remind him that half the population is under 200 on the map of consciousness, so they are not overly emotional, intelligent, self-driven, or even want to take responsibility for their lives. So I would suggest that he respects their decisions, but to not be dragged down into victim mindsets. He should always follow his conscience and his intuition and not be afraid to challenge the norm, even if those around him aren't brave enough to do so. And I want him to understand that it's acceptable to break rules, especially stupid ones, provided he's prepared to face the consequences of those actions. And I tell him that usually the consequences are quite minimal, if there are any at all. I would tell him that if there's something he wanted, or wanted to learn, or something he wanted to do, that he should find ways to bring it forward into the now. Because why have a dream and not take action as soon as possible? I tell him that if he was unhappy in a certain situation, he should do everything he can to change it, move away from it, or to modify those circumstances, or to learn to temporarily accept them. For example, quitting a job that goes against his values is probably a wiser decision emotionally than staying and compromising himself. Or perhaps he could temporarily lower his values until he finds a better job, so he won't be tormenting himself in the meantime, which once again would be such a kind and loving act of self-love. I would remind him that fear and excitement are the same emotion, just one has a negative story attached and the other has a fun, inspiring and positive story. I would advise him to not wait for motivation, because activity Taking action generates motivation, not procrastination or overthinking. And if he has plans and if he's taking action but still lacks motivation, he should ask himself, is he doing what his heart really desires him to do, or is he doing what his head thinks is sensible? And I would say that because passion and desire are game changers, and they will bring aliveness into each and every day. I would tell him there is nothing more powerful than a man with a dream and the desire and the intention to make that dream happen. So I'd say he must always be clear about his intentions for his life and himself. I'd say that for every decision that arises in his life, ask himself, is it in line with my intentions? If it is, do it. If it's not, don't do it. It can be this simple, okay? It can just be a process, and he can overwrite anxious thoughts or feelings by just following the process. Next up, I tell young John to contemplate the relationship between the words sensible and risky, because somehow he'd been domesticated to think being sensible was a good attribute, offering safety and security, whilst being risky was reckless and irresponsible and may lead to losing everything. What I would tell him is, this is a trap. This is the pen that the sheeple are led into. There is rarely safety or security if you depend on an external corporation or a government for your financial well-being. I would suggest that he consider how to become a man of value and ask himself, what skills would he need to learn and to develop so others would want to pay for his services? And how might he create revenue streams that mitigate his need to depend on external establishments for money in return for following their creativity stifling rules, which also might compromise his values, beliefs and his talent? I would remind him that science has clearly demonstrated that those who pursue what they want and make things happen nearly always outperform those who wait around hoping that things will come to them. I would tell him that it is risky to look for safety or security, and sensible to explore more fluid opportunities that will improve his life. And I'd say, if you don't fail a few times, then you're not taking big enough risks. Next up, I would direct him towards the superpowers of happiness, optimism, and trust. I'd say that these are not things that other people were born with that you weren't. You can't sit around waiting for happiness to happen or expect it to arise once you achieve a certain goal, because that's just not how it works. I would tell him that happiness is a choice. Happy people are happy simply because they choose to be happy. It's so obvious, really, but unhappy people can't see it. And why do they choose to be happy? Because it feels bad to feel unhappy. It really isn't rocket science. Happiness is an attitude. Happiness is the decision to make happiness core to how you think and therefore reflects how you feel. And that's why happy people are usually optimistic and trusting. They think about everything that could go right and thus already have good feelings even if the event never happens. And if it goes wrong, they optimistically just drop negative stories. They go, oh, never mind, it'll work next time, just let that go. If you think about it, unknowingly, they are cleverly positive ERPing themselves. They're in a positive ERP loop. It's running in their brain, and the more optimistic and trusting they are, the more the brain will reinforce those stories and their body will respond favorably. And because their brain belief system is set up to expect luck, trust and good outcomes, evidence of good outcomes is stored in their long-term memory and the bad outcomes are disregarded. Therefore, they naturally remember the good things from their past, which I think is a wonderful way to live. Now, if we contrast that with system with unhappy people who are usually pessimistic and doubtful, they are unknowingly running negative ERP loops. Just by pessimistically thinking about an event, they're already feeling bad, even if it were to turn out okay. And even if it did turn out okay, their brain wouldn't say that good memory as it's conditioned to register what's aligned with their pessimistic beliefs. So they end up with a brain full of evidence of all the things gone wrong, not evidence of all the things that went right. Now, personally, I think that it's random whether in the first 3 years of your life your carers trained your brain to be optimistic and trusting, or pessimistic, doubtful and fearful. Either way, once you know this, you can retrain your brain, as I did, by repeatedly using positive ERP I stories. But here's the rub. In my experience, most doubtful pessimists just say, oh, that won't work, or I can't do it, or I don't have the time to do that, which is the very self-reinforcing negative ERP loop that got them there in the first place. Now, I find it amusing but sad to listen to them defend their stories of how it won't work and how they won't be able to do it. So I would tell young John, evaluate where your brain is running negative ERP loops from its unconscious, and then consciously retrain them as soon as possible with new attitudes that can be adopted in a second and then reprogrammed into his unconscious brain in a month or two if he does the work. It's really important stuff. I'd advise him to learn personality profiling tools like MBTI and the Enneagram so he can better understand who he is. And I think this will also allow him to understand others so that he can love them how they wish to receive love. And then I would advise him to be honest and tell others how he would like to receive love. I'd say that if you can willingly make your partner's life as special as possible, and they willingly wish to do the same for you, you will have a very special, fulfilling relationship. And I tell him to lighten up and to have more fun and to not take life so seriously as it's just a big game. And finally, I tell young John that I can understand why, as a young man there, he was an atheist. However, his world will expand exponentially once he considers the universe and nature to have intelligence and sees himself as an integrated part of it, as an immortal soul having a temporary human experience. And by accepting that he came into this world with nothing and he will leave with nothing except what he learns, except his experiences, this will allow him to be less attached and less controlling and open to trying every new experience. I'd say to him that living in faith is far more powerful than living in fear. So these are just some of the things I would tell myself. I have to be honest and say this was surprisingly hard for me to write. And quite a few times I became quite emotional as I considered who I used to be and the pain that I tormented myself with and who I am now. Perhaps you might meditate on what you might like to tell your younger self and align that with the Values and Beliefs workbook from video 32 part 2. Anyway, thank you all for listening. I wish you all well, and thank you all for your continued support.